With the release of Checkout.js v4, you're going to start hearing a lot about promises. This section will explain what promises are and demonstrate how they are used. The goal of this section is to help you understand promises at a very high level so you understand how they work in PayPal products. So what are promises in JavaScript? So promises are a way to asynchronously run code in your application. You can execute a function that returns a promise, so the rest of the application continues to execute while the function gets the data it needs and resolves the promise, and your application then runs a block of code now that that data exists. So in the real world, I could say that I promise to give you $100 to buy a bike. Instead of waiting for me to pay, you could drive to the store immediately to save time. You wait at the store until I PayPal you $100 and then you buy the bike. You now received your bike sooner because you drove to the store while I was getting the money. So are promises supported in all browsers? No, only a few browsers support them natively today. However, we can use third-party libraries to get functionality in all browsers. So promise creation. Promises are created using the new keyword. It takes one argument that is a function with two arguments. These arguments are normally called resolve and reject, and these arguments are actually functions inside of the promise. So resolve is called when the asynchronous work is successful. Reject is called when the asynchronous work is unsuccessful. And here's an image demonstrating how you can create a new promise in JavaScript. All right, so promises completion. So promises have at least two function properties called then and catch. Then is executed when resolve is called in the promise, and catch is executed when reject is called in the promise. And here's an image demonstrating that. So in my real world example, you could think of me creating a promise here. So do some asynchronous work would be like me going out and getting money and putting it into my PayPal account. And then I'm going to resolve the promise when I pay you, or I'm going to reject the promise if I don't pay you. Meanwhile, you're going to start going to the store and then wait at the store. And once I resolve the promise, you are going to buy the bike in the then, or you are going to go home bikeless if I reject the promise and you end up in the catch. So here's a quick diagram demonstrating how promises work. So you have your application that's running. You run some asynchronous function. Normally this is some AJAX call that goes to a web service to get data. So instead of waiting on that response to come back, you create a new promise and you return it back into the application, and your application continues to run. So now if once the data comes back off the web service call, you resolve the promise, which then goes back to the then callback on the promise in the application. Or if the API call failed, you would call reject, which would then call the catch callback function in the application. All right, so now we're going to take a look at a simple promise, and we're going to do some exercises based off promises to give you a little bit better understanding. So let's open the source promises simple.js file in our training application. And what order will the console.logs execute? So you should now pause this video and take a couple minutes to look at this simple.js file and try and figure out what order you think the console.logs will appear. All right. If you didn't pause, you should now, because I'm about to go over the actual answer. So if we look at the simple JS file, we can see that at the very top we have a function async1 and a function async2. So nothing's being done yet. We have a console.log. Welcome to the simple promise example. So that's the first log message we're going to see. Then we're going to execute async1 function. We're just going to return a promise, and it's also going to go into the promise, and it's going to console.log async function has been executed with, we passed it 5, so executed with 5 as the argument. And then we have the then, but this doesn't execute until the promise is resolved. You can see here that we're using set timeout to mock some sort of asynchronous functionality. So we're actually waiting 3 seconds. And after 3 seconds, we're going to check the number. And if it's greater or less than 10, we're going to resolve it. If it's not, we're going to reject it. But that doesn't happen yet. Instead, our application continues and we call async2 with the number 11. So async2 function executes. So the next thing that would log would be async2 function has been executed with 11 as the argument. Once again, we're doing a set timeout before we do any resolve or rejecting, this time for 2 seconds. In the meantime, our application keeps running, so the next thing that logs will be console.log. I am at the end of the script. So now our application's technically done running, but we still have some asynchronous activity going on. We're waiting for these promises to resolve. We have 2 promises outstanding. We have the first one, which we can see here is waiting for 3 seconds, and the one down here that's waiting for 2 seconds. So the first one that's going to resolve is async2. But we passed async2 11 as the number. So when we come in, after 2 seconds, we'll see number less than 10 is false. So we're actually going to reject the promise with async2 rejected the promise. So that would actually move into the catch portion. So you should see catch async2 rejected the promise. Then in another second, since async1 is 3 seconds, async1 is going to go through, and we passed it 5, which it's less than 10. So it's actually going to resolve the promise. And we should see then async1 resolved the promise. So that should be the order that we actually see the console logs for this example. And then to actually see the output, we can go ahead and execute the file. So I'm just going to do node dist promises simple.js. We'll see the 4 logs immediately, and then we hit the catch from the async2 function, and then we go into the then from the async1 function. And that is what we expected. All right, so now we have promise chaining. So we can also chain promises together in the then callbacks, so that the second function will not execute until the first one resolves, and so on. So you could technically chain as many promises as you want together. So for this example, we're going to open the source promises chaining.js file and take a couple minutes to try and figure out what order the console.logs will execute. So you should now pause the video and take a couple minutes to look at that file and try and figure out what order the console.logs will execute. All right, if you didn't pause the video, make sure you do it now because I'm about to go over the answer to this exercise. So let's open up the chaining.js example. Go up to the top. All right, we see that we have async function 1, we have async function 2, and async function 3. So the first output we should see is welcome to the promise chaining example. Then we execute async 1 with the number 1. So we execute it 1, return a promise. We should see output async 1 function has been executed with 1 as the argument. And then we are waiting for 3 seconds. So our application is going to continue. But if you see, there's really nothing left in our application because these promises are actually chained together. These thens aren't firing until the first one actually resolves. So the next output we're going to see is console.log, I am at the end of the script. So then after 3 seconds, when this set timeout is done, we're saying if number is less than 10, which it is, we're going to add 6 to it, and we're going to resolve the number. So then this number is actually passed to the next one in the chain. So async 1 resolved with after adding 6, so it's 7. So we're saying dot then async 2, which now async 2 executed and has passed the actual number. So number is actually 7. Once again, returning a promise. We'll see the console.log async 2 function has been executed with 7 as the argument. Then we're waiting again. All right, after 2 seconds, it's going to go through and say number is less than 10. Yep. Add 1 to it and resolve it. So it goes to the next then clause, which is async 3. So we just added 1 to it, so now it's 8. So it should say async 3 function has been executed with 8 as the argument. So now we're going to wait 5 seconds this time. So 5 seconds go by. We're saying number less than 10, which it is. We're resolving the number. So we move back on. Number's 8. Next then clause. Number. Yep. We're out. We should see console.log done. Number is 8. Now I'm going to run that. You can see the first 3 output. A couple seconds later. And after 5 seconds, we're done. All right. All right, so now we're going to change the initial value that we send to async 1 to 5 and see what happens. So I'm going to change this to 5. I'm going to save it. Then I got to rebuild it quick, so I'm going to do npm run build. Wait for that to finish. All right, so now take a second pause the video, and try and figure out what is going to be logged this time. All right, if you haven't paused the video, do it now because I'm about to go over the answer. All right, so we changed this to 5. So we're calling, obviously, this is going to be our first output. Then we are calling async 1 with 5. So async 1 goes. We should output async function has been executed with 5 as the argument. After 3 seconds, 5 is less than 10. Yep. So we're adding 6 to it. So number is now 11. Perfect. So we're resolving it. Number comes in as 11. We should see async 2 function has been executed with number 11 as the argument. We're waiting 2 seconds. We're saying if number is less than 10, which is false now. So we're actually going to get into the reject portion. So we're rejecting it. So that actually moves us into the catch. And it's going to say catch with the error message, which is async function 2 rejected the promise. And that's going to be the end of it. So you'll notice that async 3 never ran, and neither did the last then clause. And that's because it's a promise chain. So once the chain breaks, nothing else underneath it is going to execute. Since async 2 rejected, anything after it never executes. We go directly into the catch block. So let's make sure that that's what we see. Async 1 executed with 5. I am at the end of the script. Async 2 has been executed with 11. And then we're catching async 2 function rejected the promise. Notice there's no async 3 and there's no done. So it's important to know that you can chain promises together and that anytime one of those promises gets rejected, the rest of the chain never executes. All right. So there's also a neat little function called promise.all where you can execute X number of promises simultaneously and then execute a then or a catch block afterwards. So the variable that's actually comes back in the then when you do promise.all is an array of all of the resolves from all the promises that you passed in. It's also important to note that the one argument to promise.all is an array of promises. So we're going to open up source promises all file. And we're going to try and figure out in what order the console.logs execute again. All right, so take a moment, pause the video, and try and figure out what order the console.logs are going to appear in this example. If you haven't paused the video, you should do it now because I'm about ready to go through the answers. All right, so we'll see functions above just like before. So the first thing that executes is welcome to the promise.all example. And we're calling promise.all with an array of all of our functions executing. So all 3 of these are going to execute simultaneously, even though async 1 is going to go first, async 2 is going to go second, async 3 is going to go third. We're not actually waiting on these set timeouts. So we'll see immediately, we'll see async 1 function has been executed with 2, and we'll see async function has been 2 function has been executed with 5, and then we'll see async 3 function has been executed with 9. And that should be immediate. So then we're going to see this is going to be like your promise, and then the rest of your application is running. So then we'll see I'm at the end of the script. So, and then after all 3 of these promises are done, so the last one takes 5 seconds. So after 5 seconds, all 3 of these promises will be resolved. And we go into the then portion, and we're console.log resolve values. So we passed in 2, 5, and 9. So we should see an array with the first one, the first index of the array should be 8 because we're adding 6 to 2 and resolving it. The second one we passed in 5, we're adding 1 and resolving it, so it should come back as 6. And then the third one, we're passing it in, not doing anything and resolving it, and we passed in 9, so it should be 9. So I'm going to execute it and make sure that what I thought logged actually did. See that that's immediate, the first 4, and then after 5 seconds, those are the resolved values, 8, 6, and 9, exactly as we expected it to be. All right. So that is it for the promise section. Hope you enjoyed it. The next section will be on cross-domain development.